So now we are back to person with tzara'at, but we're talking about the ritual after the tzara'at recedes from the body. That is that he commanded us that the purification from tzara'at be according to the process written in scripture. Now, when it says purification, it doesn't mean that this is used to heal the Metzora. It means that after the Metzora has healed, as it were, his skin is healed, there still is a requirement for purification. Because while there is a physical issue here, the reason it's getting the treatment that it does in Vayikra is because of the tuma, the spiritual condition that the Metzora is in. And as we talk about tuma and tahara, purity and impurity, we always grapple with how to translate it, how to characterize it, because it's a state that's way more complex than first meets the eye. A lot of people think of it as a kind of spiritual uncleanliness, and that somehow you have to be cleaned of this spiritual uncleanliness. But there's actually many more layers to it, and spiritual uncleanliness doesn't really do the job. In many of these cases, it's not a matter about being clean or unclean, but rather there is this state of being which is for some reason incompatible with the Beit HaMikdash. And there are, again, amongst the various layers of meaning and context, you'll hear like Rav Shem Shafal Hirsch will talk about this as a kind of trauma from an encounter with death, and therefore a need to withdraw. But I think you'll find in a lot of the circumstances, it's connected to withdrawing. And certainly in the case of the Metzora, they're in some kind of condition where they are meant to be alone and sort of experience the world in a kind of loneliness. I was once driving around a man by the name of Rav Altusky, Altusky. He, a blessed memory. He was Rav Scheinberg's son-in-law. And so when he would come to Milwaukee, my father used to take him around to collect. He had like a route of people that he would go to collect money for Rav Scheinberg's yeshiva, which was called Torah Or in Israel. So he'd come once a year. He would stay at our house. My brother went to that yeshiva. That's how we got the connection. And so every year my father would take him. And one year my father couldn't take him, so I ended up taking him and driving him from place to place. And this man, just like Rav Scheinberg, was somebody who pretty much his every waking moment was devoted to Torah and Torah study. So even though we were collecting money and going from place to place, when we were in between stops, he would bring up something he was thinking about, or something he wanted to talk about. So this was 40 years ago. I even remember when it was like December, almost 40 years ago, maybe 39 years ago. Anyway, so he asked me, why is it that when Choshech, when the Makkah, when the plague of darkness struck the Egyptians, why does the Torah have to tell us that it did not strike the Jews, that the Jews living in Goshen did not experience darkness? After all, it had previously said that these plagues did not affect the Jews. So why does it have to reiterate it with darkness? So after letting me think about it for a while, he suggested that the darkness that they experienced, at least as the commentaries understand it, is not just a problem of navigating in the dark. It was an imposed aloneness, that you were isolated and alone. Being isolated and alone is a terrible torture. It's one of the worst tortures. When we put somebody in solitary confinement, it's one of the worst tortures we can think of for another human being, is to isolate them and keep them alone and away from other people. In most cases, for most people, it's a plague. It's a punishment. It's suffering. But there are people who actually look for it and almost revel in the opportunities for that exact same kind of isolation. There are maybe times in everybody's life where you're trying to work on something and you need a period of working on it where you're undisturbed. There's certain kind of work like that that can only be accomplished in silence or in quiet. We've talked about this before, but at the beginning of the Corona pandemic, I really did feel like, for the first time, I was experiencing a degree of that kind of aloneness or silence, even though Tzippy and I were in the house together. But we couldn't. There were no kids. There was no friends. There was no shul. There was no classes in the beginning in person. And therefore it just felt like the world had quieted down to a great degree. And I found myself searching online for communities that live in silence. And the Trappist monks and related kinds of monks, the Ramana Maharshi, the Indian mentor who lived in silence for many years. And this just notion of the work that can be done in silence, and how there are certain things that can only truly be done in silence. That silence itself is a context for things that are often too big to articulate, and therefore they don't find a place in a world that is just mostly words. This is Elie Wiesel's understanding of Vayidom Aaron, that Aaron was silent. And Elie Wiesel was explaining that silence doesn't mean he chose not to deal with it or to ignore it, but what it means is that silence was the only kind of context that could hold the enormity of what had just happened, the death of his sons. Elie Wiesel was saying that in truth, silence is the only context that can really hold the enormity of what happened in the destruction in Europe. And so it seems like with some of these circumstances of Tuma, that's what it's going for, that it's going for that kind of withdrawal, and to some sense of aloneness and silence that allows for somebody to deal with the certain aspects of their life. It also needs to be pointed out that the first time the Torah ever says something is not good, it's lo tov hayos adam levado. It's not good for humans to be alone, and certainly in a larger sense, and for a longer period of time, it eventually would not be good. But it's that doesn't mean that it isn't good in measure. And like we talked about, even with the Nazir, that one of the understandings of why the Nazir brings a sin offering is because God doesn't want this to become the norm. He doesn't want people to refrain from his creation. The Nazir, by not drinking wine, is refraining from some aspect of the creation. And maybe there's a sense of withdrawal that the Nazir symbolically is going through when he becomes a Nazir, that the Torah it doesn't want us to make this the rule. But clearly the Torah understands that there are going to be times when it's the right thing to do for somebody to withdraw, maybe in something like rehab, where somebody needs to withdraw from their friends, from their family, from everyday life, and focus on whatever their pressing issues are, and so that they eventually can re-enter society with the benefit of lessons learned while they were away. So this is part of the depth of Tuma. It's not in every case of Tuma, but certainly with this person, this is the element that comes to the surface. Again, maybe you have something that's made up of many elements, and in different circumstances, one element is more prominent than the other elements. But in this one, it seems like the aloneness, the kind of imposed aloneness that is present in Tuma, rises to prominence, and it's the one that becomes dominant. So even though the person has physically healed, that is not resolved. So the person now has to go through a ritual that is going to be part of the resolution. At first glance, this ritual sounds like the beginning of Macbeth. You take cedar wood, the witches that had to have boil, toil and trouble, whatever those lines are. And that is with cedar wood, hyssop, crimson dyed cloth, 2 living birds and living waters, and that he do everything stated with those things. So there's going to be a kind of a burning of certain elements, and there's going to be a bird is going to be slaughtered, and its blood is going to drip. The blood's going to drip into water. Another one of the birds, the other bird is going to be dipped in that blood and then let free. And this is part of that ritual. Eventually, the Metzora goes to the courtyard of the Beit HaMikdash and has blood placed on his thumbs and big toes, and there's haircuts involved and oil and things that are part of this ritual. When you look at the commentaries about this, they suggest that these elements that are part of the ritual are themselves symbols of lessons that he has hopefully learned. That is, the cedar is often in Tanakh a symbol for stature, the great cedar trees. So somebody who was arrogant might think of himself like a great cedar tree. Our cedar trees that that you mostly see around here are not that dramatic looking, but I was I have a cousin who has a place in Lake Tahoe, and he has these enormous cedar trees, and they really do look imposing and dramatic. So the cedar tree would represent arrogance. The hyssop, on the other hand, is like a little bush that grows close to the ground. It would represent humility. The crimson dyed cloth, it's actually, I think the red comes from a worm. And so again, another symbol for humility. The birds for chattering, and especially the bird who's let free represents the idea that your words go off and you can't take them back. In that manner, there are commentaries that go through the kind of symbols of the various elements that are there. And these would be the notions that this person is meditating on during his period of isolation, and hopefully and rehab, so that when he re-enters society, he is fruitful and giving as opposed to harmful and a taker. And through this exact process, the person becomes pure, as scripture explains. Behold, it's already been made clear to you that there are three types of things that purify from impurity. One of them is general, and two of them are specifics to two types of impurity. Indeed, the general one is purification in water, which we talked about before, actually bathing in a mikvah. The second type is the sprinkling of purification water, and that's what you see when a person is being purified from contact with a dead body. So that person also does go to a mikvah at some point, but an essential part of the purification is the ashes of the red heifer together with the spring water. So that person has water sprinkled on them. And that is something specific for the impurity of a corpse. And the third type is cedarwood, hyssop, scarlet dyed cloth, two living birds and living waters. And that is something specific for tzara'at. So tzara'at has its own ritual. He didn't mention the ashes of the red heifer for some reason here. He mentions the sprinkling of the purification water, but he doesn't mention by the time the water is being sprinkled, it includes the ashes of the red heifer. For some reason, though, he's not emphasizing the ashes of the red heifer here, which is interesting. And that is something specific for tzara'at. And the regulations of this commandment, meaning the purification of someone with tzara'at, have already been explained in the first chapter of Tractate Negoim. See Parsha Metzora, Mishnah Torah defilement by leprosy. It's sort of also interesting that we don't, although we find out that Miriam has tzara'at after talking to Moshe and Aaron, there is no discussion of her having to go through these rituals in order for her to become cleansed. It doesn't actually say that a Kohen came and identified her condition as tzara'at. So it's not clear that she was, in fact, a classic case of a metzora. But it could be she was, and it just doesn't go through the details of what happened. All right, and now that is that he commanded the metzora, the person with metzora, to shave, and that is its second purification, as is explained at the end of Negoim. And that is saying, and on the seventh day he shall shave. The essence of the words have already preceded this. We talked about in Sefer Mitzvot, positive commandment 93. 3 shave, and their shaving is a commandment: the Nazarite, the Metzora, and the Levites. The laws of this commandment have already been explained at the end of Negoim, and here I will explain the reason for our counting the shaving of the Metzorah and the bringing of his sacrifice as two separate commandments, because as we've seen before, and as he talked about in his introduction to this book, it just because something is a mitzvah doesn't mean we count it as a separate mitzvah. There are all manner of mitzvot that are really a part of a grouping that, and you might think of the general group as one mitzvah, not necessarily every detail, even though when you're involved in the detail, it itself is a mitzvah. So, instance, we say visiting the sick is a mitzvah, but there are all sorts of steps that go into visiting the sick, like let's say you have to travel to get there. So the traveling itself would be part of the mitzvah, or at least what we would call a hechsher mitzvah, preparation for the mitzvah. But you would already say that you're involved in the mitzvah in the travel. We even call that shliach mitzvah. Somebody who's like an agent to do a mitzvah. So from the time the person receives the agency, they're already considered to be involved in the mitzvah. So every detail that is part of your plan or process is doing a mitzvah, but we don't count them separately. And sometimes like in some of the mitzvahs that we've seen, we count it as one mitzvah. Let's say you have the 4 species, even though each gathering and bringing together each one of those species is absolutely essential for the fulfillment of the mitzvah, but it's one mitzvah. So wouldn't you think that the various specifics of how a person becomes pure from tzarat would all be considered one mitzvah? So he's sort of he's responding to that by saying that in this case he chose to count the separate elements as separate mitzvahs. And that is because there's no connection for the Metzorah between the shaving and the bringing of his sacrifices. The purpose of the shaving is distinct from the purpose that is accomplished by bringing a sacrifice. And that is because the purification of the Metzorah is dependent upon his shaving. And the 6th chapter of Nazir, they said, what is the difference between a Nazirite and a Metzorah? It is only that the purification of this one is dependent upon days, and the purification of that one is dependent upon his shaving. Meaning to say the Metzorah. And when the Metzorah shaves and completes his shaving, he is pure from continuing to give off impurity like a creeping animal, as is explained at the end of Negoim, which is an interesting comparison. So what it means is he's impure for one day. He is a source of tumah. A creeping animal, one of the shrutzim, is considered av hatuma. Again, in the kind of complex, multi-layered notion that is tumah, impurity, there is an element that is similar to contagion. So if an item is tameh, under certain circumstances, it can make something else tameh. And that thing, under certain circumstances, could make something else tameh. So it depends on the intensity of the tumah. So for instance, a human body, if somebody will touch a human body, that person becomes impure. Now, if that person touched, let's say, a sacrifice, they would render that sacrifice invalid, impure, invalid. That person could make something else impure. That something else could make certain things impure. And you could have, usually, biblically, it only goes 2 steps. But rabbinically, they added steps, especially with food and drink. Also, when it comes to truma, we say there are 3 steps. And when it comes to sacrificial matter, we say there are 4 steps. So you have to identify the origin of the tuma and the degree of that tuma, that impurity, in order to know if that comes in contact with something else, does it make it tummy, and under what circumstances. So it's sort of like finding patient number 1 in a as you're looking at a kind of mass contagion. You're trying to identify the source, and you also want to know if somebody else becomes contagious from, in other words, they interacted with patient number 1. Does the next person become contagious to the same degree? Do they become to a lesser degree? Does it start to dissipate as it goes farther? So you have that to some sense, with purity and impurity.
I just wondered if I've come in contact with a dead body and I touch my wife, has she, at that point, she is impure?
So she is not impure to the degree that you are impure. But let's just see here.
Because when we're talking about whether it's a positive commandment to purify you, but you're not commanded to be in a state of purity. But if you're a public hazard,
what did you say about a public hazard? What were you saying?
If you're Tommy and you can transmit it to other people, and you can't go up to a coin on the street and shake his hand.
Right. I'm trying to think. I don't know why, but it's sort of funny, but I can't think of if you just touch the other person, because the way it works is the body is called avi avot hatuma, which means it's actually the highest degree of impurity there can be. Then somebody who touches it is called an av hatuma. Now, when you're an av hatuma, you're really called like first degree. I mean, not even first degree. You are treated like a source also. You are not as tame to the degree of a dead body, but you are still called a source. You're an avatuma. And the next thing you come in contact is going to be a rishon. So, all right, so I'm just going to read from, this is from Wikipedia, avatuma. In the realm of Tuma and Tahara terminology, the term avatuma, father of uncleanliness, or simply Av, is a rabbinic term for a person or object that is in a state of Tuma. Second in severity only to corpse uncleanliness. Anything that is an Av hatuma, such as carrion, the blood of a menstruant woman, seminal fluid, can render those persons who touch it defiled at a further remove, known as first grade. A person or object that is Av hatuma has the ability to transfer tuma to another person or object, such as clothing, but usually at a downgraded level of tuma, while they in turn have the ability to transfer their tuma to both foods and drinks. In the case of there are 2 types of avatuma. The first being the one textually listed in the Torah, such as the carcass of any of the 8 creeping things. The second being one of rabbinic origin, such as a grave area that had been plowed, or foreign land, or a dead human bone the size of a barley corn, amongst other things. I'm just looking. So it does sound here like if a person who touched a corpse or was in a room with a corpse would then touch another person, that other person would be tame. But that other person would only be tame for 1 day, not for the full 7 days. So, because that's what he means here, that's what the Rambam means here, that when he calls giving off impurity like a creeping animal, this mitzora is also an av hatuma. Interestingly, if that mitzora walks into a house while he has tzarat, anybody else in that house will become tame unless they leave right away. There's like it's not exactly like a corpse, but it's very similar to a corpse. He can actually do that. He can actually, if you're in the room with him for a short period of time and you didn't touch him or anything, you're just in the same room under the same roof, you become tame. But again, it's tame for one day, that's why the Rambam's comparing it to a creeping animal, because a creeping animal is also an av hatuma, so it's considered an original source of tuma, but it only makes things tame for one day. So that would be the same thing with somebody who came in contact with a body, or somebody who came in contact with a metzora. You'd be tame for one day, and you would just need to go to the mikveh. You wouldn't need these other means to. So what happens here is, it sounds like, according to the Rambam, that once he's become physically healed, then he's still tame, and if he touched something else, they would be tame. Once he has his second haircut, which means his whole body is shaved, that stops. But even then, however, he is still lacking complete atonement until he brings his sacrifices, like the other ones that lack complete atonement, as is explained there. So, for instance, the Nazir or the Yoledet, the woman who gave birth, they still have, and the Zav, we had the case of the Zav. So they still have to bring sacrifices in order to get what's called complete atonement. So the purpose of his shaving was to be pure from continuing to give off impurity like a creeping animal, whether or not he brought his sacrifices. Whereas the purpose of bringing his sacrifices is the completion of his atonement, like the other ones that lack complete atonement, meaning the Zav and Zava and the woman after childbirth. We've already been preceded by their saying, "For are lacking complete atonement." We talked about this. And there it is made clear that the Nazirite is not one lacking atonement. All right, so there's really three, not the Nazirite. Rather, the action of sacrifice is included in it, meaning to say that the shaving and the bringing of the sacrifice permit him to drink wine. However, one of them will not suffice without the other. Instead, the shaving is connected to the sacrifice, and the sacrifice is connected to the shaving. That's what the Nazir. The only one, and they only achieve their purpose when they are combined. And that is that they permit those things that were forbidden to him in the days of being a Nazirite. That doesn't necessarily mean he can't touch a korban. It means he can't drink wine or come in contact with the dead. And in the 6th chapter of Nazir, they said, one who shaves over his sacrifice and is found to be disqualified, his shaving is disqualified and his sacrifice didn't count for him. Behold, it has been made clear to you that the shaving is from the stipulation of the sacrifice, and the sacrifice is from the stipulation of the shaving. So even though Nazir and Metzora look similar, because both of them have to shave and bring offerings, he is saying they are not. On the outside, they look similar, but on the inside, they're not. And that's why this shaving is unique and gets a special reckoning, a special numbered mitzvah. And is also explained in the Tosefta that a Nazirite that has completed his days is still forbidden to shave, to drink wine, and to become impure with a corpse until he does the whole process. And that is the shaving of purification, as is explained in the 6th chapter of Nazir. And that is that he shaves at the opening of the tent of meeting, throws his hair under the urn, and offers his sacrifices, as scripture explains. And you'll find that in most places they call the bringing of sacrifices shaving. He's right. When you learn the Gemara in Nazir, a lot of times, instead of saying the words bringing sacrifices, they'll just say shaving. It's like shaving became the one word to use, legaleach or tiglachat. That word became the catchword that includes the whole process, shaving and bringing offerings. And you'll sometimes see in the commentaries, just to remind you, even though it only said shaving here, it means bringing up the offerings. And you will find that in most places they called the bringing of the sacrifices shaving. And in some places in the Mishnah, they said an explanation. One who says, behold, I'm a Nazirite and it is upon me to shave, by which he means that he will bring the sacrifice of the Nazirite and offer them on his behalf. Behold, it's already been made clear to you that shaving is used to mean the bringing of sacrifices. So there the Gemara says it overtly. And the reason for this is that is part of them, as we've explained. And it is with their combination that the status of Nazirite is removed and the Nazirite may drink wine. All of this, he's explaining. We are not talking about the Nazirite. We're talking about the Metzora. But that whole chunk was just to show you why the Metzora is different than the Nazirite. The Metzora's shaving is not part of the sacrifices. It's a separate entity. It's a separate thing. It's not like the Nazirite. So therefore, he went on and gave us a whole talk about the Nazirite in order to show the contrast. However, the shaving of impurity of the Metzora is a law of the commandment, as we've explained earlier. So therefore, the shaving of the Nazir does not get separate mention. It's not one of the commandments. It's part of the bundle that goes with the offerings. So the shaving and the offerings get a bundle. But here it's separate. You have the sacrifices of the Metzora and the shaving of the Metzora. All righty. I look forward to continue tomorrow. I know you wanted to leave the subject of Metzora, but no, tomorrow we are continue with it.
What am I after?
Oh no. Yeah, so tomorrow we're still before Chatzos. So we're allowed to still learn Torah until noon, halachic noon. So we're good. But after that, but that might be the last bit of Torah you learn before Tisha B'Av.
Wouldn't that be nice? Let's get into something a little deeper. Okay, just one thing. If I touch somebody else, okay, so I touch the corpse and I touch a person. Now, this person, you say his tumah lasts only 1 day, but he still has to have purification.
But a mikvah. Same thing like
right. Right.
Mikvah.
But yes, but if he didn't know that the guy was
right. I hear what you're saying. That's why you're saying that this person should observe some form of isolation because they may cause other people to become tameh. And the thing is also with Anita, like what responsibility does Anita have to tell people that she's Anita? Nowadays, none, but I'm saying in those, she has to tell. But in those days where she also could confer impurity to somebody else or to something else. And also, so what responsibility do they have to clarify this to others, and do they have a responsibility? Yeah, that's a good question. That deserves some thought.